At midnight on Radio 1, and at the moment on Radio 2, Frank Delaney's taking the network round midnight.
By daybreak, gangs of youths were on the rampage. Police, under attack, replied with shotguns and tear gas to disperse the mob. Troublemakers and terrified mourners were caught up in the pandemonium. ANC leaders blamed agents provocateurs for stirring up the violence. Houses were torched, vehicles set ablaze, as the fires of anarchy and anger burnt just yards from the stadium where the funeral service was being held. But not even the smoke could obscure the power and the poignancy of the farewell to Chris Hani. But dignified tributes to the people's hero were mixed with concern over the mayhem triggered by his death. The government, who didn't attend the funeral, came in for blame from Nelson Mandela.
Those who have deliberately created this climate that legitimates political assassinations are as much responsible for the death of Chris Hani as the man who pulled the trigger.
Guns were everywhere as right-wing vigilantes patrolled white suburbs near the cemetery, but they couldn't stop isolated outbreaks of arson and looting as radical youths tried to disrupt this historic day. But the burial went as planned. Comrade Hani, soldier and politician, laid to rest with the full honours of a man of war and peace. Jeremy Thompson, ITN, Boksburg, South Africa.
Our next report on the early evening news: agents smash into siege building and pour in tear gas. Plan to fly blinded Siad to Los Angeles for medical treatment. And Ian Botham says it was a good innings. An armoured vehicle has smashed into the walls of the Texas ranch where a religious cult has been under siege for over 7 weeks. The FBI is pumping tear gas into the building, but the cult leader, David Koresh, and 94 followers are still refusing to come out.
What is almost certainly the beginning of the end of the 51-day-old Waco siege started before dawn, Texas time. A large engineering tank moved up to a compound building and punched a hole in the brick wall with a big steel boom. Since then, tanks have been picking away at the compound, knocking out windows, breaking up the roofs, and destroying brick walls. Gas canisters and stun grenades were thrown through windows to try to drive the cult members out of the buildings which were being knocked down. 94 people are still in the compound, 17 of them children, who must be terrified in the din and destruction the tanks are causing.
We will continue to gas them and make their environment as uncomfortable as possible until they do exit the compound. We are using non-lethal means. We are not assaulting the place. We had no FBI agents go into the compound. Even though we have probably had over 200 rounds of ammunition fired at us, we have not fired back. We're using the ultimate amount of restraint, but we are still putting the pressure to make sure they come out.
As the destruction continues, the FBI say they aren't worried about a sudden mass suicide pact by cult members. But after the tragic storming of the compound on February the 28th, when 4 agents and 6 cult members were killed, federal agents will probably not storm the building. They may just demolish it piece by piece. Cult members are now apparently keen to negotiate, but the FBI may finally have lost patience. David Rose, ITN, in the United States.
A shell has exploded close to a British Army base in Bosnia, but there were no casualties. British helicopters today airlifted scores more wounded refugees from Srebrenica. Also on the move was the blind boy Siad Bekric, whose plight has symbolized the Bosnian tragedy.
6 days after being brought out from Srebrenica, Sead Bekric began a journey that could take him to the other side of the world. The 14-year-old unaware of the impact he's made outside his home. It was television pictures of Sead and his terrible injuries that brought the horror of the Srebrenica siege into millions of homes. Now the outside world wants to help. Enko, the little brother who's now Sead's eyes, led the injured teenager to the UN helicopter pad at Tuzla Airport. British and American doctors want to find out if Sead's sight can be restored, but initial examinations have not been optimistic.
injuries to the eye itself, fractures around the eyes, and he probably has some secondary infection since it's been going on for 9 days now.
Sayad's mother and little brother will be travelling with him, first to Amsterdam, then on to either London or Los Angeles, where eye specialists have offered their skills to try to help a boy who became a symbol of his country's suffering. But there are hundreds of Sayads whose stories will not get the same attention. Today, the UN airlift of injured from the besieged town continued. Pictures from inside Srebrenica show the UN helicopters using the town's football pitch as a base for the evacuation. The airlift has been a remarkably calm affair, people who spent days hiding in basements bringing out their wounded, though there was a rush to meet the first helicopter that landed yesterday. The UN say by prior agreement between all sides, the vast majority of those brought out have been injured Muslim soldiers. A successful airlift of injured is just part of the UN plan to save the citizens of Srebrenica. The next stage is to negotiate safe passage for around 50,000 civilians still trapped there. Paul Davis, ITN, Tuzla in Bosnia.
Here, the government is sticking to its policy of sanctions, not airstrikes, against Serbia. The Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, today insisted that bombing by the West would do more harm than good.
Though ministers were briefed by military experts about the option of airstrikes, they firmly rejected them for now. Above all because they are impractical in the conditions and complexity of the Bosnian conflict. And because it would jeopardize the existing humanitarian effort.
We can't rule out anything as the situation develops, and we shall stay in close touch with our allies and partners. But we should not go down this or any other route without a reasonable judgment that it would do more good than harm.
Labour welcomed much of the Foreign Secretary's statement, but said the United Nations should issue an ultimatum to the Serbs that they must now seek peace.
Unless they are prepared to do that, the Security Council should consider authorizing a punitive airstrike against the Serbs' supply lines in Bosnia.
Only isolated voices urge military action now.
By bombing their communications, their lines of supply, their airfields, and the arms factories that are supplying them.
But with the American administration likely to agree later today that now is not the time for military action, most MPs accept that sanctions, provided they're tightened up, must be given much more time to work. It's a depressing thing to admit, they say, but in the current maelstrom of Bosnia, it's their only practical option. Mark Webster, ITN, Westminster.
Two moves in the rail dispute today. One union is considering a further strike, another is holding talks with BR management. Stephen Cate is at the headquarters of the RMT. Stephen, who's settling and who isn't?
Well, ASLEF hopes it can settle. It had a meeting earlier today with the BR management, and they're taking away various recommendations and at this moment are discussing with their own executive ways of ending their strike. As far as RMT is concerned, well, the 21-member executive of RMT are meeting at the moment, and they're deciding whether to have another one-day strike. I believe, in fact, they'll finish this meeting and say something like this: we want to test the water again with BR before we actually announce a date, or if they do set a date, it'll be a long way off to allow negotiations to take place.
But still the probability of another strike.
Still the probability, the possibility. In fact, a letter here, which I have from Paul Watkinson, the BR personnel director, says if there is another strike, that's only going to make matters worse and harden attitudes. I believe that is absolutely the case, and I think RMT realizes just that.
Thank you, Stephen. Thousands of children in England and Wales went back to school today, but with a term of uncertainty ahead. The Education Secretary, John Patton, warned teachers and governors that they have a legal duty to carry out national tests. Harry Smith reports from one Midlands school where tests have already been postponed.
For these 7-year-olds, back to school meant back to lessons, but that's not what should have been on the timetable. Today was to have been the start of 3 weeks of tests. But after the decision of 2 of the teaching unions to ballot members on a boycott, the head of this school, who's a member of the NUT, decided to postpone the tests.
The ballot has to take place over several weeks, and we could be in a position where we're doing the tests and then at the end of the day find that the ballot result enables us to not do them, yet we've already done them. And so it seems to us sensible to postpone the test.
For the teachers, it meant abandoning months of preparation.
Well, the children don't know that they're not going ahead because they didn't know if they were going to have happen anyway. We don't tell the children because the work is just part of their work. They're not aware of what's going on at all.
Among the parents, there was some support for the teachers.
It was all right when we were at school. We didn't have all this, did we? So why change it now?
Well, I think the tests are a bit much, really.